Hi, I'm David Schwager. I practice in Luzerne County, and I'm honored to serve as the 126th president of the Pennsylvania Bar Association. On behalf of the PBA and the Pennsylvania Bar Institute, I welcome you to PBI's program Holding the 2020 Election Under Crisis, Assessing the Constitutional and Legal Challenges. This top-notch panel of experts and most timely program have been developed with the assistance of Keep Our Republic, and we thank them for their support. On behalf of the PBA and the PBI, I wish to thank our esteemed panelists today for their presence and what I know will be significant and enlightening insights into the topics on everyone's minds in these final days before election 2020. Because we have so many topics to cover, unfortunately, we will have limited time for questions during today's program. If you're attending for CLE credit, you could submit for credit at the conclusion of the program. I thank you very much for joining us today, and now I'm pleased to introduce our panel to you. Richard A. Gephardt served for 28 years in the United States Congress, representing Missouri's 3rd Congressional District, home to his birthplace of St. Louis. He served as House Democratic Leader for more than 14 years, as House Majority Leader from 1989 to 1995, and Minority Leader from 1995 to 2003. Mr. Gephardt is President and CEO of the Gephardt Group, providing strategic counsel on federal government relations and domestic and international labor relations issues. Mary McCord serves as legal director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017 and principal deputy assistant attorney general for the National Security Division from 2014 to 2016. Previously, she was an assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Tom Ridge served as the nation's first assistant to the president for Homeland Security from October 2001 through December 2002, and the first secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from January 2003 through January 2005. Previously, he was governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from 1995 through October 2001, and a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1983 through 1995. Governor Ridge is president and CEO of Ridge Global, an international security and risk management firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. And also, I have to add, like me, Governor Ridge is a Dickinson Law alum, a Penn State Dickinson alum. And so we're so honored to have all of you here with us today. And now let's get right into it. Everyone knows, of course, that November 3rd, next Tuesday, is Election Day. I ask the panel, please, what are the other key calendar dates in the 90 days between now and January 20th, Inauguration Day? And what troubles you the most about election-related legal issues that may come up during that time period, particularly with respect to us here in Pennsylvania? Governor Ridge, may I ask you to start?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I would have thought that as a former Dickinson graduate, you would have deferred to somebody like Mary, who probably paid a lot more attention to it. But let me give it a shot. First of all, I think everyone on the panel appreciates the fact that in the 2020 election, Pennsylvania is a critical state. My friend Dick Gephardt and I have been working together, and I also want to recognize that this is a interesting time when Republicans and Democrats have joined together to assure our fellow countrymen, not just Pennsylvanians, that the election is safe, it's secure, that the rhetoric around potential widespread fraud is what someone coined the term many, many years ago as fake news, and yet trying to preserve, reduce the anxiety and underscore the legitimacy of the election is something that I've been privileged to work with Dick on now for several months, along with multiple other Republicans and Democrats. So let me get to from my perspective, your question relates to a couple of specific dates. November 3rd is the final date a vote can be cast. Depending on the jurisdiction, and I believe in Pennsylvania, we have 3 additional days for the votes to be counted. And I think it's Wisconsin, the Supreme Court gave them, I believe, 9 days for the vote to be counted. And I guess from my perspective, at least in the short term, Those are the 3 days that are most important, 3, 6, and November 12th. And trying to tap down on, I think, the anxiety about the most fundamental institution in this continuing experiment of self-government is our elections. And the fact that there have been some efforts to undermine their credibility and legitimacy. And let me just make one final comment and turn it over to my distinguished panelists. Ben Ginsberg, who has operated within the Republican Party for several decades, who is probably the most prominent conservative Republican lawyer, election law lawyer, several weeks ago wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said he's been involved in this for decades. And the allegations with regard to massive fraud, there's no historical antecedent. And I would add, given the decentralized nature of how we count votes, given that decentralized nature of how we count votes, the whole pretense of massive fraud is just that. It's a pretense. It's a fabrication. So I open this conversation with those thoughts, and I look forward to contributing a little bit further in the discussion. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Governor. And you're exactly right, of course. Every single precinct and certainly every county, every state would have to be subject to that fraud in order for there to be widespread fraud. So I think we as Americans should certainly have a sense of comfort and confidence in the system.
But Dick and I refer to them as guardians of liberty. I mean, they are. They've been doing this for literally decades, and they're intrepid, and they'll do everything they possibly can. And one of the thoughts that has been projected, frankly, by the president is that there's any delay post November 3rd, it's tantamount to fraud because of the extensive use of absentee ballots. By the way, it was up almost 50% in Pennsylvania's primary. The fact that absentee ballots take a while to count, and if you know anything about the counting process, there's technology involved to validate signatures. There's barcodes involved to validate the participant's signature and the like. So much to be discussed, and I'll just get out of the way. Just had to comment that it's a bipartisan effort, and I'm pleased to join my buddy Dick Gephardt.
Thank you. Congressman Gephardt, do you have anything you'd care to add to what Governor Ridge has shared with us?
Oh, the governor handled it beautifully. I'm going to defer to Mary to give us some of the dates about the Electoral College and the other things that have to happen in, I think, December. And then, of course, in early January, the Congress has to receive those electoral slates from states and then count them, I think, on January the 6th or 10th. I forget the dates. But what I wanted to say...
That's why we've got Mary.
Yeah, exactly. But I wanted to salute my friend Tom Ridge and all the others that have come together, former federal officials. We got 40 former federal officials and other groups of former federal officials who have come together because of our worry that this election would not be valid. Because of the pandemic, because we knew there was going to be a historical high number of mail-in votes that would take some time to count. And we were worried because the nation is so polarized, and you've already got both sides kind of saying the other side is cheating already. So we're worried about getting the vote to be counted. We're worried about the vote being reported. Worried about both sides accepting the results of the election. And that's critical in any democracy. When I was leader for 14 years, I was always in awe that we could decide really complicated, controversial, bitterly flawed issues. But after the vote was taken, the losing side, and by losing side, I mean not only the members of Congress, but the people out in the country who were supporting their argument, were willing to grudgingly accept the result of that vote because they thought the process was fair. And that's what we're in danger of losing in this election if half the people, when the results are finally announced, feel the process was rigged, it wasn't done right, it was messed up, and they're not willing to accept the results. If you can't have a valid election in a democracy, and incidentally, this is the oldest democracy on earth, 240 years. We've taken votes during national crises like the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, what have you, after 9/11, and we did it. And we can do it. And we need to give people confidence, which is what Tom just talked about, that this system has worked, is working, will work. We just need to have confidence in the people that are working hard every day to make it happen.
Congressman, Mary McCord, can you share with us some of your insights about what's going to happen between now and Inauguration Day, and key elements and maybe some historical context for those dates?
Sure. There's a whole lot of dates that could come into play. Everything will go smoothly, and a lot of these dates will not really be part of our national conversation. But first, as Governor Ridge indicated, of course, Election Day is on the 3rd. Under Pennsylvania law, as I understand it, county boards may start pre-canvassing absentee ballots that morning. They, by that evening, should start canvassing them, and they have to start canvassing them by Friday. They then have to report their preliminary tallies to the Secretary of the Commonwealth by the Tuesday after Election Day. So that would be the 10th. That's just sort of the counting within Pennsylvania. Now, of course, Governor Ridge also referred to the recent Supreme Court's denial of a stay in the case that had gone through the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which had allowed for 3 extra days for absentee ballots to be received so long as they were postmarked by Election Day and still be counted. That decision is now standing because the Supreme Court refused to get involved in that case. The Supreme Court, I will say, did indicate in a statement, I shouldn't say the Supreme Court, in a statement joined by Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, and Justice Gorsuch, did suggest that this didn't mean the Supreme Court couldn't review the counting of those ballots at some future time. So I would urge everyone, if you have not dropped off your absentee ballot yet or not engaged in in-person voting, drop off your absentee ballot in a drop box or in-person vote as soon as possible and before Election Day, so that you don't have to worry about whether that 3-day window could get struck down at some point in the future. Other dates are also very important. So the December the 8th, it is what is known as a safe harbor date. That's the date by which, if in any state, if they have followed state law and determined which slate of electors will be put forth from that state, that is a safe harbor that Congress will defer to later. Because what happens, as everyone of course knows on this call, is that when you're voting, you're not actually voting for the president and the vice president. You're voting for a slate of electors from your state, because Pennsylvania, like 47 other states, is a winner-take-all state. So the winner of the majority of the vote gets all of the state's electoral votes, which is why Pennsylvania is, of course, so key. Those electoral slates, the electors have to meet on December the 14th. Those slates then go to Congress. Congress meets in a joint session on January the 6th, which you should recognize is after the new Congress will be sworn in on January 3rd. So if there is a change, for example, in the Senate or the House, it's the new Congress that will be sworn in and will be then opening up these electoral slates. If they open up the ballots and they see that some state, for example, has set 2 slates of electors up, like let's assume in one state, there's controversies maybe over the counting, maybe there's litigation, lawsuits about irregularities, what have you. It is possible, we hope this won't happen, but it is possible that a state, Pennsylvania, as well as others, could send 2 slates of electors. One maybe that the legislature wants to send up, one maybe that the governor has certified, and those could be competing. And that's when this idea of the safe harbor comes into play. Because when Congress is then looking to see which slate are we going to accept, if one of these slates was complete by the safe harbor date of December the 8th, and the votes were regularly cast, then that's the one that Congress should defer to. the safe harbor date wasn't met, or if both slates they claim met the safe harbor date, the Congress will look to which one did the governor certify, because the Electoral Count Act, which is the statute, the federal statute that authorizes all these dates, the Electoral Count Act does create the governor as a tiebreaker when there are competing slates of electors. Now, that's not foolproof either, because it could be an argument would be made that the governor wasn't following state law when he certified a slate of electors. And so that's another place where there could be litigation. So when there are these instances of multiple slates, Congress meets in joint sessions, separates, House meets, Senate meets, they come back together to see if they can't agree on which slate they are going to accept, or whether they're going to reject the slate from that state altogether. If no decision is able to be made, then the 12th Amendment kicks in. And under the 12th Amendment, the House decides the presidency and the Senate decides the vice presidency. Now, when the House does that, they do that based on one vote per state, based on the delegation of that state, whether it's a majority Republican or majority Democrat. So it's not as though all of the Congress, all of the House gets to vote on that. It's by state. If there's still no resolution, things are tied up in litigation, et cetera, on January 20th, by the Constitution, the incumbent does not just automatically stay if there's not a resolution. Instead, there would be an acting president, and there's a whole line of succession for acting presidents, but the first person in line is the Speaker of the House. The second is the Speaker pro tem of the Senate. So now, again, that would only be acting until the resolution of any disputes over who had actually validly won the election. So that's a lot of dates and a lot of complications, but you asked the question about dates, so I gave you the dates.
I appreciate that. And tell me, can you tell us anything about the tumultuous election of 1876 as it relates to some of the things you've just shared with us?
Sure. In that election, that was the Tilden Hayes election, there was a dispute. And this, is right coming out of the Civil War. And there was a dispute between the Democrats and the Republicans as to the slates of electors. We had something kind of like what I've outlined. It was eventually resolved through compromise. And in the wake of that, Congress passed the Electoral Count Act. And that's the act that established all these various dates that I've indicated. Now, that act is almost inscrutable. I've given you a lot of dates, and they're in that act, but it is a very, very long sentence with a whole lot of independent clauses, a whole lot of commas, and scholars have written long law review articles, and I am not one of them, trying to make heads or tails of how this statute would work in real life. The idea was to be an improvement on the problems of the Hayes-Tilden election, and an improvement so that we'd have a way to do this systematically going forward, but it hasn't really been tested in any significant ways. In fact, there are even some questions about whether it's even constitutional. So if we get into position where we're relying on these various different stages of the Electoral Count Act, I think, there are areas where litigation could be had. There are also the possibility of political compromises, which is what did, of course, happen back with Hayes in the 19th century.
Sure. Now, we often hear about certification of election results. Is certification a true legal term? Is that something that is a other than just commonly used? Is that a real element of this whole process? I don't know.
If you were directing it to me, those are terms used in the statute about certifying the slate of electors. So it does have some bearing on the process, of course, because as I indicated before, there is this tiebreaker that goes to the governor when the governor has certified, and that's by statute.
Very much.
David, I just wanted to observe, I don't have another question, but earlier today, I was joined by Secretary Chertoff, who succeeded me and by Janet Napolitano and Jay Johnson, two former secretaries of DHS. It was a really fascinating interview we had with Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show. And I thought it was important, and I say this to remind those in attendance, but hopefully the broader public that watched it. You have 4 secretaries of Homeland Security, and we are in total agreement that the elections will be conducted in a fair, proper, and secure way, and that we encourage that people to appreciate that November 3rd is the last day the votes can be cast, not the last day the votes will be counted. And it's a shame that we've reached this position. I never thought, frankly, as a young man interested in government and history, that we'd ever find a day where we'd be questioning the most fundamental of institutions in our democracy, and that's voting. When I was secretary, we did an offsite with some of our leaders, and instead of getting one of the Beltway consulting groups, we decided we'd define our own mission statement. And the first 3 words out of our mission statement were preserve our freedoms. It had nothing to do with security, but if you think about it, preserving our freedoms is at the heart of our security. And when people start doubting the legitimacy of election, and there's enormous foreign influence, and we know that. There was a bipartisan review of the 2016 election, and it was incontrovertible, bipartisan conclusion, enormous Russian influence, and there's no reason not to believe that they're doing the same thing now. Not that they're going to play around with electronic voting machines, but they're out there in Facebook and every place else trying to deal with changing opinions and therefore outcomes. So I didn't, pardon the editorial, but to follow on Mary's comments, I think, again, it's a call to action for all Americans, regardless of your political persuasion, and frankly, for whom to vote for. Final anecdote, they started, just listen to this, the United States of America. They started boarding up the first floor office windows in my office building in downtown DC because they're worried about social unrest. And as Michael Chertoff suggested in the interview this morning, it's as if we're in a third world banana republic. Shame on us, but that's why this forum, and I know I'm very pleased to participate, and I'm going to follow Mary's advice. I'm going to stand in line. I'm not going to vote absentee. I'm just going to stand in line for how many hours it takes to cast my vote, that's for sure.
Well, surely we're not a banana republic, Governor Ridge, as Secretary Chertoff said this morning. And I did see that segment on the Today Show. You did a fine job. And of course, as Congressman Gephardt told us earlier, we have 240 years plus of experience, to show that we're not a banana republic. Congressman Gephardt, Mary McCord shared with us a whole bunch of different parts of the process. And of course, a lot of it has to do with your former stomping grounds, the Congress. How do you think, if it got to Congress, what do you think would happen? How would people be acting? What do you think the atmosphere there would be, and how do you think it would play out?
Well, I hope for the best, but I worry about the worst. And the reason I worry is that you always have to remember that Congress is a reflection of the American people. And if the American people are polarized as much as they are, then the Congress is going to be polarized because they reflect the sentiments and the feelings of the American people. Mary would give us more detail on exactly what could happen if, for instance, the Congress gets faced with dueling slates of electors from states. Which slate do they take? That becomes really a political act. And as I understand it, a lot will depend on whether the Democrats retake a majority in the Senate or not. Because if they don't, then you're going to have a split Congress politically. You're going to have the Democrats controlling the House, most likely, and the Republicans would retain their control in the Senate. And then Mike Pence is as I get it, the chairman or whatever he would be called of that joint session. So he could, push things in the way he wants. However, if the Democrats take a majority in the Senate, I think it would become more difficult. So it's as Mary said, this is a morass that I hope we never get to. This is tough sledding.
Speaking of morass, we have a question from Mark McKeough. Mary, you may want to take the first stab at this. If a state legislature submits a slate different than the governor's, do they do that by vote of each chamber, or can the speaker and the president pro tem do that on their own?
Well, I do not know enough about Pennsylvania state law really to answer that authoritatively. I think that it would be a very unusual circumstance anyway, right? Because normally what you're talking about is the votes are counted, they're reported to the Secretary of the Commonwealth, and if your candidate has the majority, the entire slate goes for that candidate. And so the legislature doesn't normally really have to get involved in that. So the only reason the legislature would get involved, it seems to me, is if there are disputes about the counting of the ballots, whether it's continued dispute over this extra 3 days and a continued desire to litigate that and have those 3 days worth of absentee ballots that come in after Election Day, but still were postmarked before Election Day, whether they want to continue litigating that through the Supreme Court, and whether the U.S. Supreme Court, and whether the U.S. Supreme Court is willing to entertain that lawsuit, which would raise a lot of interesting justiciability issues. So it depends on whether that is going on or whether there are other challenges so that the legislature potentially could come together and seek to take some sort of action to either override what it expects the governor will certify as the results, or come up with some other process. Now, obviously, doing that could spur its own litigation if there's not already established law, because changing the law after election, I think, would be very susceptible to challenge, even beyond changes in the law before the election. So I don't want to suggest by the dueling states of electors that there's like a process and that's a normal thing. It would be abnormal for sure, but not beyond the realm of possibility. As we've seen, I think there's something like 400 lawsuits already around the country challenging various aspects of the voting and ballot boxes and which votes can be tabulated and voter suppression efforts, et cetera. And so, not to make more work for lawyers, but lawyers seem to be having plenty of work related to this year.
As the Bar Association, we have no problem with that. Yes, Governor.
It lends itself to a very interesting irony, doesn't it? I mean, think about this for a moment. You got a president who said, I need to know on November 3rd, and those don't bother counting the absentee ballots, whether it's 3 days after, 9 days after. What an interesting irony it would be if Vice President Biden prevailed on November 3rd with all those votes counted, exclusive of the absentee. Then when he reversed his position and say, wait, we're not final yet, we ought to count the absentee ballot. So it sets up to be a remarkable irony if we think about it. And I am hopeful, frankly, that it's, well, everybody knows my position.
Yes.
And so I'm hopeful it ends up at the first time I've ever voted for a Democrat president candidate. Sorry, Dick. But I'm pleased to cast my vote in that regard.
Congressman Gephardt, did you want to say something?
Yeah, David. So what they both talked about really increases the importance of these county election commissions being able to get the votes counted with a historic high volume of absentee ballots. That's what we're all worried about. And I think there was a primary in Pennsylvania a few months ago where it took a matter of 6 days or something to count the mail-in ballots. That was a fraction of the number of mail-in ballots you're going to have in this election. So, and as Mary said, you could have court contests over the validity of ballots as you go through this, I guess. So that would delay it even further. So this is the problem area, is can the election officials get this done? We put together a group that Tom and I are part of called a National Council for Election Integrity. We've raised $14 million. We're all even now running ads in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin telling people that this could be an unusual election. It could take a long time to count the votes. And during that counting time, people should be patient and peaceful, and they should demand that every vote be counted before anything is reported. And if there are protests, and there could be, and Mary knows a lot about this, people have to reject violence. They have to remain peaceful and respectful until this process can be completed successfully.
We're going to move on to some of those types of issues in just a moment. But Michael O'Day had a question just to finish up the area that we were discussing previously. He said, this month at a rally here in Pennsylvania, President Trump briefly alluded to the possibility that the states may decide this election and that, quote, we have more states than them, close quote. The Atlantic article recently published details this scheme to have the election results essentially overturned and have the individual states therefore vote on and decide the election. Do you have any thoughts, Mary, on that scenario?
Well, first of all, I would never look to the president for legal advice. So to the extent he was suggesting anything that had legal, significance, I would look elsewhere. And I'm sure that the person who asked the question would agree with that. But the process that I've laid out before, that's what the federal statute requires. Now, the Constitution does leave it up to state legislatures to determine the manner of voting. It is Article 1, Section 4, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But it does allow for Congress at any time to make by law or alter those regulations. So I would say that the Electoral Count Act is Congress's effort to legislate in this area. And so we would be back to the sense if the state decided, again, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, if the state legislature decided to somehow overrule the processes that are already existing within that state for certifying the slate of electors, that's something I think would be challenged. And even if they sent it up to Congress, that is something that Congress would be looking at when it determined which slate to accept. So Congress could, again, and I'm just giving you the law without the politics of it, Congress could say, well, that's not that's not in accordance with law for the legislature to come in after the fact, change the process, and send up a different slate of electors than what the governor has certified, or than what the count seems to be saying. On the other hand, to take off just the legal and put on the political, that would also somewhat come down to, as Congressman Gephardt said earlier, who is in control of the houses of Congress, and are they going to do this on pure politics, or are they going to try to actually follow the Electoral Count Act? So a lot of unknowns there. But I do think that the point that Governor Rich made earlier about, suppose the election day returns are showing a Biden victory, makes me think of another point before we move on that I think is really worth talking about. And Professor Nate Persily out of Stanford has spoken and written about this, and I've been on some panels with him, which is how I learned from him. It is entirely possible that there will be a lot of results on election day. I mean, many of us have been telling the public and the media, be calm, it may take some time. There's so many mail-in ballots, there's so many absentee ballots, and in many states, they don't even start counting those until election day or thereafter. But it is also possible that in a couple of big states, if the results are so overwhelming that they go up, that you can actually make some, and if they've been able to vote open and count early voting ballots and absentee ballots, before election day, that you could actually have results that would make things a little more clear. And so I think, we need to keep that in mind. It's, we're all preparing for this lengthy period of uncertainty, but it's certainly possible, particularly if we were to talk about a landslide, it's certainly possible that we would have a decent idea by Thursday or by the day after election day or within the first few days.
Thank you. Moving on to a different area of discussion, and this is one certainly for Governor Ridge, given his past position as Secretary of Homeland Security. Does the federal government have the right to send troops to protect the counting of the ballots?
That's a great question. What I know is going on now, I think that is still the primary province of the governor, and he would be required. I mean, it came to my desk. You still can deploy the National Guard, which is an extension of the federal government. That was one of the more troubling aspects of what transpired with the use of DHS employees in the Portland position. I think they were sent in unilaterally without consultation with the governor or with the mayor. What I note is that very appropriately, given the civil unrest over the last couple of days in Philadelphia, the governor, very appropriately, has called in the National Guard to deal with it. And so without giving you 100% clarity and affirmative response to that, my inclination is to conclude that it would be up to the president to make the request, that they can't come in unilaterally, because basically the election code, and that's the reason there have been so many individual cases taken to the Supreme Court, by and large, the federal government has deferred to the states to conduct the elections consistent with the Constitution in the manner in which they conduct them. And therefore, I think the deference would be to the governor to use whatever devices he needed, and if he required, to ask the federal government for support. But the statute's pretty clear. Election law is state and local, it's not federal, and that's why you see so many variations on a theme. Final comment, and this is a real problem. We're talking to my friends in Pennsylvania. We tried very hard. The National Council on Election Integrity. I'm working with Jennifer Granholm on something called Vote Safe. There are a lot of us working together to get Pennsylvania, to get the legislature to change the rule so that they begin processing, not even counting ballots before Election Day. And it was rejected. I mean, we couldn't get that across the line, which means they got to start opening the external envelopes before they get to the second envelopes. There's no conceivable way that we'll have the kind of results, and Dick referred to it. It's unprecedented. By the way, Mr. President, it's COVID-19. A lot of people are voting absentee. So it's a real challenge for Pennsylvania going forward. And unfortunately, the eyes of not only the country, the world may end up on us, because I thought, sadly, we weren't able to act in concert as Pennsylvanians first, but at least begin the process of counting these votes before November 3rd.
Thank you very much. You know, a lot of people are concerned about voter intimidation, folks. In fact, here in my home area, Luzerne County, there have been concern raised about a group called the Rod of Iron Ministries that holds the AR-15 in very high regard, and they've had a very vocal and loud presence outside the Luzerne County Election Bureau building. Any thoughts on what can be done, should be done to prevent voter intimidation at the polls? And then maybe Mary will chime in on the subject of, there is a fine line between, you know, voter intimidation and First Amendment rights. How do we balance those two concerns? Anyone on the panel? I'm not sure who would like to go first.
Well, let me just take a quick stab at this. You know, I find it rather, I find a lot of things inconsistent, but for the president to be embracing law enforcement and at the same time creating potential conflict in these individual communities, it's just, it's regrettable, and I think it can prove to be a real problem. And I think everyone going to follow the lead of my other panelists to say, look, it's about being patient, and we just need to make sure that, to the extent that local officials make sure there's talk about some safe distancing between the protesters and those going in to vote. And it's an added burden on local officials, security officials, to ensure that there is that safe distance and that kind of intimidation is held to a minimum. That's why I'm going to stand in line. I want if somebody shows up to try to see what happens.
Mary, what about the line between First Amendment rights and what some view as voter intimidation?
Sure. I want to talk about that. And then I do want to go back and talk a little bit more about your last question about sending troops in, because Governor Ridge gave a great answer. There's a few more details I'd love just for your listeners to hear. But on voter intimidation, so under federal law, voter intimidation is illegal. It's criminal. It's also the basis for a civil cause of action under the Voting Rights Act for intimidation. And intimidation isn't defined in the federal statute, nor is it defined, generally speaking, in state statutes. And every state has some form of voter intimidation or voter interference law. But the type of things that have been recognized as voter intimidation would be things like threats of violence, physical threats of violence, armed threats of violence, or armed, what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, armed private unauthorized militias purporting to protect or defend or patrol the line or defend the sanctity of the vote or protect against voter fraud using authority they don't have. Things like challenging people directly, their qualifications to vote while they're in line or when they appear. Things like following people to their cars after they vote and taking down their license plates. These are all things that can be very, very intimidating to voters. And so even though there are First Amendment rights, of course, to express your views about which candidate you prefer, those rights do have to yield, and there are Second Amendment rights, and in an open carry state like Pennsylvania, to carry a firearm for your own individual self-defense. Those rights do have to yield sometimes in the face of the government's compelling interest in preventing voter intimidation. So, for example, every state, including Pennsylvania, has a buffer zone, a no electioneering zone within a certain number of feet of the door to the entrance to the voting place, at which no one can engage in any type of electioneering. That means handing out leaflets, trying to get people to vote for a particular candidate, waving banners, etc. Now, unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, that no electioneering zone is very, very small. I think it's 10 feet. So it's really almost no zone at all, particularly when we have a pandemic and the lines are probably going to go well beyond 10 feet. But voter intimidation laws apply everywhere, not just within the no electioneering zone. So even outside of that zone, election officials, law enforcement can take reasonable actions to prevent people from being intimidated, even if it means asking, people who are being very loud and harassing and boisterous to move a little bit further away from the line, for example. Or if you have an armed group of individuals who is purporting to be protecting against voter fraud, they have no right under federal or state law to self-deploy as a private militia. Well-regulated militia has always meant regulated by the state. They don't have a Second Amendment to deploy as this private armed group of individuals asserting authority, because the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court has told us, protects an individual right to bear arms for self-defense, but has held as far back as 1886 in Presser v. Illinois that it does not prevent states from prohibiting paramilitary organizations. And in so doing, it upheld a state that still remains on the books of 29 states that bars bodies of men from associating together as military units or parading or drilling in public with firearms. The Supreme Court said in 1886 that it was without question that states had to be able to prohibit that. The Supreme Court reiterated that in 2008 in District of Columbia versus Heller, which is the first time that they announced this individual right to bear arms for self-defense, and they contrasted that with the bar on paramilitary organizations. And then all states do bar them. In Pennsylvania, there is a very elaborate, comprehensive scheme by which the militia is established, and the only lawful militia is the State National Guard or the Pennsylvania Guard. And to the extent that unorganized militia applies to all able-bodied people available to be called forth by the governor, it's only the governor that can call them forth. They can't self-activate. Pennsylvania also bans paramilitary activity, techniques, use of firearms that are capable of causing injury or death, knowing they're going to be used in some sort of civil disorder. So there's that type of activity is not protected and certainly could be intimidating. And election officials, law enforcement can take reasonable measures to make sure that voters don't have to face that type of intimidation. And I should be clear that the Supreme Court also upheld these no electioneering zones when challenged, even under the strictest First Amendment scrutiny. The Supreme Court held that it was actually content-based restriction, although I think some of us would argue it's not because it applied to everyone and was neutral. But their rationale, or the majority's rationale, is that because it was about campaigning, that it was a content-based restriction. And even under the strictest scrutiny, as everyone knows, applies to First Amendment things that are content-based, regulations that are content-based, it still upheld that no electioneering zone because of the government's compelling interest in protecting against voter intimidation. So we do have an area where different constitutional rights can come head to head, but when we're talking about the area around a ballot box, I think the government's interest in preventing voter intimidation wins out, or certainly should. If I can, David, go back just a minute to the last question. I want to make sure people are clear, because in addition to what Governor Ridge said about the state National Guard being, the governor being the one who can call them out as may be necessary if they need to, if there is, activity in the streets that they need to address, that is the prerogative of the states. But when we talk about this idea of federal military, I think your original question was, can federal military essentially be sent in by the president to, guard the ballot box or guard the counting, whatever? No. The Posse Comitatus Act is a central fundamental principle of our scheme here, which prohibits active duty military from engaging in domestic law enforcement, with one exception. And that exception is under the authority of the Insurrection Act, which is the only time really that the president can activate active duty U.S. military to engage in domestic law enforcement, and that is to quell insurrections, rebellions, etc. So this notion, and the president sometimes uses very loose language that he'll send the military in. He doesn't have the authority to do that except under the Insurrection Act. He will sometimes also say he's going to federalize the National Guard. And as Governor Ridge said, the National Guard is a state institution that reports to the state. There is a provision under federal law for federalizing the National Guard and making them then part of the U.S. military. But again, that is a circumscribed statute that is only applicable to certain purposes. So it's not just that the president at any time can say, I'm sending in U.S. troops to do, domestic law enforcement functions, or I'm federalizing the National Guard. It's not as easy as that. What we saw in Portland this summer, and what we saw in the District of Columbia clearing Lafayette Square, was actually not, as Governor Ridge indicated, wasn't federal troops, and nor was it National Guard. Those were DHS officers that were activated under DHS authorities to protect public U.S. government buildings, but they were brought in from all types of places in Portland to engage in essentially crowd control in ways that have now caused a lot of litigation, and one could argue made things more volatile in Portland. In D.C., in addition to DHS troops under the Attorney General's authority, he was able to activate a number of federal officials, like at the Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. Marshals, even the Bureau of Prison, under separate statutory authorities to deploy them to engage in that type of domestic law enforcement. But those examples didn't actually involve active duty military. Still, it's a morass of different statutory provisions that can be very difficult to wade through. But I think the point for folks on this webinar is it's not just as simple, as the president's saying, we're going to send in the troops.
Thank you, Mary. As I'm formulating many of these questions, and the question I'm about to ask, I keep thinking about Secretary Chertoff talking about the Banana Republic, because who would have even thought I would be asking this question? But if the incumbent, if President Trump should lose the presidency, but doesn't accept the results, what are the steps that would be taken, and by whom, to force his removal? Anyone have any thoughts?
God forbid.
God forbid, of course.
I must say, sadly, there are some private conversations going on now about that very unlikely but still possible outcome. I keep thinking about when a group of Republicans went to President Nixon and said, "It's over, move on." And I guess it would be my firmest hope and prayerful hope that it ever got to that. And if every vote's counted and we can get through this November 3rd with the kind of outcome that we hope will minimize that possibility, I think it'll have to be a political engagement, probably more than a legal one. I can't think of I see Mitch McConnell and others knocking on the door, and hopefully some family members and some of his financial supporters, but I can't give you a good legal answer because I don't have one.
Understood.
I think, David, to my mind, the only real law or provision that governs this is the Constitution, which says on January the 20th, the new president or the present president should be reinstalled or the new president should be inaugurated. And I assume at that point, if he's not willing to leave, the Secret Service or other federal officials are going to have to take him out of the White House. I don't see that as the biggest worry.
Yep.
To me, the worry is what we've been talking about all morning here, which is a closely contested election. And then we get into all these legal cul-de-sacs, Electoral Count Act, Article 12, what the Congress does, et cetera, et cetera. And it's why, look, we're a nation of laws. And everybody on this call, I assume, has some good connection with the legal profession. That is the bedrock of our society. We have to hang on to the laws and regulations. When I was leader in the House, I used to say to my caucus all the time, the only thing that matters here is process. If we lose our process, then nobody's going to think the voting is fair. And it's the same thing with this. And we've just got to land this plane. That's all I know. We've got to do everything in our power to make sure we have a valid election that ultimately is accepted by both sides.
And so maybe that was an extreme question that I asked, but Michael Bloom has a more general sort of a question. Assuming that Vice President Biden is the Electoral College victor, what specific concerns, Mary, would you have about actions that the president might take between the date of that determination and January 20th? Are there any that we should be concerned about?
Well, I actually think a whole lot of what is going to happen in terms of what's happening on the streets is going to depend on what the president is saying. I am hoping that he will somehow have a change in tone and tune in this remaining several days, and will be ready to get on board with urging calm while the votes are being tabulated, as opposed to continuing to suggest that any delay in tabulating the votes must mean that the election is rigged. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any signs of that. And I think what he says is going to very much impact what is happening in America. Litigation will also impact what is happening in America, because litigation will further delay results. But litigation will also be directly related to him, because he will at least be involved in some of that litigation if it's his campaign that's bringing it. There could be other entities bringing it as well, but he has a lot. He has the ability to urge peace and make this go a lot more smoothly, or make it really into a parade of potential horribles. So to get directly to that question, he could be urging people to take to the streets. He could be urging people, as he has done in some of his public statements, including at the first debate, his failure to denounce civil unrest, his calling on his supporters to go watch the polls very closely, which poll watching. We can talk about, if people want, which is, regulated by state. Not just anybody can go and watch the polls. People can be outside, but they can't intimidate, as we talked about. He can, and then he told a violent, unlawful militia extremist organization to stand by. So he could send dog whistles out to these extremist organizations, these unlawful militias, to either deploy to protect against election officials who might try to cheat, deploy to the streets in opposition to the state, as many of them did in Michigan in opposition to the governor's stay-at-home orders this spring. They've done so in Ohio, Kentucky, Idaho, elsewhere in opposition to the state. He could be urging them to come out to just defend against violent anarchists, as he has done throughout the summer and fall of racial justice demonstrations, suggesting that any isolated acts of violence are the results of, Antifa, which he's calling domestic terrorists, without ever acknowledging that people on the far right have also been responsible for acts of violence, and without acknowledging that the vast majority of these demonstrations have been wholly peaceful. So we unfortunately have to prepare for lots of different eventualities that are going to be dependent on the kind of things that I think he is saying on election day, the day after, and all the days after that. And then, of course, if he eggs on groups to deploy armed, that's going to spur counter protests, which of course could give him the predicate to invoke some of these authorities that we were just talking about. And so I kind of hate even talking about this in public this way, because I don't really want to give a roadmap for this, although I'm sure he's got plenty of people who've already thought this through. But I just can't. I so agree with Governor Ridge and Speaker Gephardt. Like, across party lines, people have got to be very, very, strongly opposed to any type of political violence in this country. We decide our presidents based on ideas and policies, not based on intimidation and political violence. And I do hope that, even though I think, some of the Senate Republicans have been far too quiet for far too long, that if we get into a situation where where our democracy is in the balance, that you will have more and more people stepping up to denounce any of that type of violence. I mean, we don't want to be a failed democracy. I have been working in the last 6 or 8 months with, I can't tell you how many scholars and researchers who have spent their careers working abroad to help protect fledgling democracies, to help protect against failure in democracies, to help protect people's rights to vote in other countries. I can't tell you how many of them have now opened up U.S. offices, and they're doing it here. They're doing here what they'd only ever before done abroad. And that's just, not anything I ever thought I would see. And I think everyone, no matter, where you are on the political spectrum, has to unite against that. I'm sorry to be on my soapbox here. I just went there.
Go ahead, Tom.
Go ahead, Dave. First, Al.
Well, I always like in these conversations to get a little philosophical, so we kind of step back and look at what is going on. I believe in God, but I think we evolved from animals. And if you observe animals, chimpanzees, let's say, our predecessors, they pick their leaders by violence. They settle their differences with violence. We have a bigger brain and the ability to communicate, which is our great gift from God. To use it, we have to really use it. And that means communicate. That means the writing of laws and processes. That means democracy. To me, democracy is the highest expression of human evolution. But we can often revert to that animal, primal behavior. And I'm sure Tom would agree with me. I've been through a lot of elections through the years, and often in elections you see violence break out. It's not horrible violence, but violence. People smash windows in cars because they're so worked up about the candidacy of some candidate. They tear down yard signs, and people get in fistfights over elections. This is normal kind of reversion to animal behavior. So this is what we're fighting against. And as both speakers have said, it doesn't help when the President of the United States is suggesting that this is okay. It's not okay. We have to reject violence in any form of seeping into this electoral process. And that's what we all have to say over and over and over again, that it's not only abnormal, but it is completely unacceptable behavior.
Well, I can't, I risk following such an eloquent statement, but well said, Richard, well said. Richard and I have been working through several organizations, and he referred to the National Council on Election Integrity. And one of the most recent communications we've made privately, but I can share with you, is to the major networks who will begin covering, I mean, they were covering the election now, but to try to implore them to begin the process of educating their viewers about the need to be patient, about the unprecedented number of absentee ballots that have been cast, the need to let the local officials count them, and an appreciation for the need to wait several days until all those ballots are counted. And I think, in spite of the fact that the president continually beats up on the media writ large, we're hopeful that the average American, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their choice for president, doesn't want to see their neighbors or their neighborhood or their community embroiled in violence as we wait 2, 3, or 4 days to get the outcome from some of the pivotal states. So it'll be very interesting, and I plan on watching very carefully to see whether or not our entreaty to the national networks is effective. We'll see. I think it will be. I think everybody's vested in this.
I hope you're right, Governor. Thank you. Since as was said earlier, we are ultimately, though, a nation of laws, and laws, of course, engender lawsuits. Should we be assuming that this election ultimately, regardless of how we get there, will ultimately be decided in the United States Supreme Court? Unless, of course, it's a landslide.
I think that one thing we need to be clear about is it's never that the election, maybe this is semantics, but the election is not decided by the court, right? Even in Bush v. Gore, they didn't decide which candidate would be the winner, right? They decided the case or controversy in front of them, which was about, whether recounting ballots with hanging chads or dimpled chads or what have you. And then after that, candidate Gore, conceded and didn't continue to fight. People can argue about whether he should have or not, but that's how that resolved. It wasn't that the Supreme Court decided the case, or decided the actual election. And so the same is the case with any litigation here. What they would be deciding if they accept jurisdiction is whatever that particular issue is in front of them. Now, the result, the impact of that could end up, obviously impacting who the winner is. But I do think sometimes the loose language is at least confusing to non-lawyers. Of course, we're all lawyers on this call, but at least confusing to non-lawyers. I also think, it's been interesting watching these recent decisions or non-decisions out of the Supreme Court when they've either granted stays or denied stays, because at least the Chief Justice seems to be starting to draw some lines in the sand about what the Supreme Court might get involved in and what it might not. And he and other justices that now make up the majority definitely seem to have an aversion toward federal court involvement in what, under their view of the Constitution, should be left to the states to resolve, which is, again, under that Article 1, Section 4, the states who have the first sort of authority for how the elections within their states will be handled. And so that's why you had a result in the Wisconsin case, which it was a federal court who was intervening to essentially overrule the will of the state legislature. And that's why the stay of that federal court decision was, that's why that was stayed, because of this aversion to the federal court getting involved in the state's decision. with the Pennsylvania case that just went up, we don't have the only indication we have of the thinking about this comes from that statement of Justices Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch. And even though they indicate that what happened here in terms of the state Supreme Court itself intervening, they indicate might be unconstitutional. That is different from the line that Justice Roberts seemed to be drawing. So Justice Roberts, while he didn't get into what would happen if it had been a state court and not the federal court, he did make a distinction and said, while the Pennsylvania applications implicated the authority of state courts to apply their own constitutions to election regulations, this case, meaning the Wisconsin case, involves federal intrusion on state lawmaking processes. So, that could give us some indication of at least where some of the justices may fall, depending on how litigation gets to them, which leads to the question of would they actually decline to hold justiciable certain lawsuits that might reach them, which of course would then leave it in the hands of whatever the highest court of the state decided.
Sure. And, aside from the Supreme Court resolving any of these state issues or other election-related issues via litigation, are there any mechanisms for alternative dispute resolution of some sort? Could you envision anything like that, Mary?
That's probably a good question for my other colleagues on the panel who have had been elected officials before. I have not. I think that political resolution is always a possibility, and I don't know that I would call it alternative dispute resolution because I think it would be a political resolution. But that has historically, that has happened historically, and so I think that would be part of the things we've been talking about in terms of where the president is and whether he can be persuaded along with members of his party to reach a political resolution if things do get to the point where it looks like we're getting through the Electoral Count Act, we're potentially having the House decide the election or having an acting president. But I think Speaker Gephardt and Governor
Congressman Gephardt, in your years on Capitol Hill, do you have any thoughts as to how potentially a political resolution could come about in the current climate if instead of these issues being resolved via litigation alone?
It's possible, but I'm skeptical that, I'll say it again, the Congress is pretty badly polarized because the people are polarized. If it were like it was when Tom and I were there, I would have much more confidence that you were in a better situation to come up with political solutions, bipartisan political solutions. But I've got to be optimistic. I've got to hope that present leaders and members of the House and Senate could come together and try to solve these problems for the good of the whole, put country over party, and try to make some decisions that need to be made.
Governor Ridge, in a different era, you would hope that there were elder statesmen on both sides of the aisle who could sort of talk some sense into the folks who are currently in power on either side of the aisle to try to reach the sort of political resolution that Mary talked about. Can you envision anyone playing that role on either side realistically?
Well, I think Mary alluded to it, and I've got to believe, and I'm only going to speak to my side of the aisle and publicly express my disappointment over the past a couple of years, particularly when the president has made some pointed comments and very frankly public criticism of circumstances that suggested to me that the rule of law was not important to him, that the constitutional protections and freedoms were to be deployed when it was convenient, ignored when it was not, politically, those kinds of things. I'd like to think under these extreme circumstances, and we are hopeful that the extreme circumstances don't call for political intervention on my side of the aisle. But given the silence, and many of you are familiar with the Lincoln Project, it's a group of Republican strategists who are working very hard to defeat the president. And frankly, they're going after a couple of Republican senators. Remains to be seen. But my hope would be if it got to the extreme circumstances that we've all alluded to and about which we are all fearful, that the political intervention by the leaders on the Republican side of the aisle would force the outcome that we thought was appropriate given the election results. I also think, listening to some of the iconic political pollsters in Washington, D.C., who are looking at the potential turn in the Senate, there's a really good chance that both the House and the Senate will end up being in Democrat hands. And in that case, it'll be a very polarized vote. If we got to that extreme circumstances that Mary was talking about, where it's left to the House and the Senate to compromise, we know what the outcome would be. But before that happens, let's pray that frankly, our lawyers are less involved. Common sense and appreciation for the Constitution and the historic transfer of power would preclude anything beyond what I can anticipate to be some, in certain cities and certain communities, some social unrest from November 4th through whatever. So,
let me ask a different question that we have here from Neil Middleman. We're focusing on Trump v. Biden at the top of the ticket, but of course there are all sorts of races as you go down ballot. The U.S. Senate, as we've talked about, sort of hangs in the balance. Even the U.S. House, could theoretically switch depending upon results. And then, of course, here in Pennsylvania, we've got the 3 state row offices and state legislative and senatorial races and all sorts of other things. Will any of this tumult have an impact on those races, and how so?
Let me answer that first, if you might, and then forgive me, I'm going to have to excuse myself. At 1:30, I've got a Zoom call with people who are worried about the very subject that brought us together today. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to spend this time with you, but
and Governor, in that case, I have a different question I'd like to hear you answer, and that is, how can we as lawyers get involved, and what are the best, most effective ways that we can volunteer to fight for election integrity on a local, state, and national level? I'd love to hear your comments if you have that insight for us.
Well, my sense is that through the work we do, we have the visibility in our community, not only as lawyers, but it's been my experience that many in the profession choose to get involved in a lot of other activities within the community, nonprofit work, things of that sort. And I guess the best thing, the most obvious recommendation, I believe, is for them, at least for the time being, is to communicate with family and friends and those with whom they're involved. Basically, the message of this PBA session. Massive fraud will not occur. It's going to take some time to count the votes. And if you start building out that network and asking them to translate and transmit that message to those, clearly there'll be some extremes, more likely on one side of the aisle than the others, but it's certainly possible some leftists to create some chaos, not necessarily within the party, but just some leftist group who want to create social unrest regardless. But I think for the time being, I guess lawyers are probably poised, having been retained by both political parties and by both candidates. But the remaining of those who defended the rule of law and the Constitution, right now I think it's a civic opportunity, not duty, but a civic opportunity to reach out to your network and ask them to reach out to that network. We need peace, we need patience, we need calm, we need a peaceful transition. And that message has to be inculcated and repeated over and over and over.
Governor Ridge, thank you so much for sharing the last hour and 15 minutes with us. And
I apologize. And by the way, Mary, I took a lot of notes. I thought I was back in law school. It was fabulous. I'll talk to my friend Richard Gephardt later. And thank you, David.
Take care. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Tom.
Mary or Congressman Gephardt, do you have any thoughts on how some of the post-election machinations might or might not impact some of the down ballot races?
Sure. Well, if a counting gets balled up or messed up, and then electors are sent in an extraordinary manner by state legislatures or whatever. The question I would have is, do they ever get the votes counted for the other races? Because if you stop the count and they never go back and count it, then you could win on the machines or win on the in-person data, but then you can't get the rest of the votes counted. That's the only way I think it would have an impact on down ballot races. If they go ahead and count all the ballots, which they should do, then all those races will be decided one way or the other.
Thank you very much. Congressman, as long as I have you, there is a question from Terrence McKeever, and I assume the factual underpinnings of the question are correct, but maybe you have some insight into whether or not it's at all damaging to the current atmosphere that apparently he's indicated that Hillary Clinton never formally accepted the results of the 2016 election. Is that in fact a true statement? I'm not familiar, frankly.
I don't remember exactly what she said, but as I remember, the next day she made some concession statement. Maybe she didn't say it as clearly or as unequivocally as some would like, but she certainly didn't want to carry on contests of the results in various states, which I guess she could have done. But she made it clear that she was not going forward and that the election had been decided. And that's really what you got to do. Yeah. I was leader in 2000, and I was sitting in my office in the Capitol with Bill Daley, who was Al Gore's campaign chairman. And we were worrying the Supreme Court was going to decide this that day. We were going to go out, however, and have a press conference in which we were going to say Florida ought to count these votes and get it done. And while we were talking about what we were going to say, we got a call saying the Supreme Court's decided this and it's over. And I turned to Daley and said, well, what do we got to do now? And he said, well, we got to call the candidate. And we did. I forget exactly when that happened, but a day or two later, I think it was a day later, Al Gore conceded that he had lost the election, even though he was disappointed, obviously, tremendously. That's the kind of acceptance of this process that has to be. And that's what has us worried now. The president's made a lot of statements to the contrary to that sentiment. And I just hope against hope that if we get a result, even though it may be close and may be contested, that either side that loses will accept that result. In one of our National Council meetings, one of our Republican farmer members said to me, well, what if the Democrats are not willing to accept another electoral college victory by the president, even though he might lose the popular vote? And I said, the law is the law. We will accept that. We have to accept that. If you get yourself in a place where you don't want to follow the law because you don't like the law, we're in big trouble. This is a nation of laws. It's the process that counts. You have to hang on to that process. It's all we have.
Very much, Congressman. Mary McCord, I think this is a question for you from Michael Schwager. If the U.S. Supreme Court at some point were to throw out Pennsylvania ballots that were mailed before Election Day, but don't arrive at the election office until the 5th or 6th of November, as you know, the Supreme Court has sort of reserved the right to review this decision after the election, would those ballots still be counted for statewide, non-federal elections?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's gets to the down ballot question that Speaker Gephardt was talking about, that, you know, if there was a ruling that they can't be counted because the state Supreme Court exceeded its authority by, you know, deciding under state constitutional law what the procedure should be when the legislature had not, then I guess they couldn't be counted at all. I suppose the legislature potentially, if it saw fit, could step in to change something about that. But again, any changes post-election, I think, would be also vulnerable. So I have to think that if ultimately they were to decide this, that those shouldn't be counted as a matter of the state Supreme Court exceeding its authority under the federal Constitution, that would mean all those ballots are out. And
unknowingly, I have a follow-up question from Fred Cabell, who happens to be the PBA's director of legislation, our legislative director. But it's a perfect follow-up to the question. If the U.S. Supreme Court were to adopt Justice Alito's likely rationale, could the court issue a split decision holding that the federal offices should be treated in one manner, but leave to the state, probably the state Supreme Court, how the state elective offices were to be counted?
So again, we're reading tea leaves here. I mean, it's just a barely over 3-page opinion. And I don't see that distinction in this and it's not an opinion, sorry, a statement. I don't really see that distinction here because, I mean, here's what he says. The provisions of the federal Constitution conferring on state legislatures, not state courts, the authority to make rules governing federal elections would be meaningless if a state court could override the rules adopted by the legislature simply by claiming that a state constitutional provision gave the courts the authority to make those rules. So he goes to make whatever rules it thought appropriate for the conduct of a fair election. So I don't see that in this, although I'd have to read it more carefully with that in mind, all 3+ pages. But it's a great question.
Yeah, Congressman Gephardt, let me ask you the question that Reginald Evans poses. Is the Electoral College obsolete?
It's a very fraught question, and there's a lot of really good arguments on both sides, and I've heard them all. My own belief is that if we keep electing presidents with just an electoral majority and not a popular majority, that it's going to really be corrosive to our system because people are going to begin to believe that their vote is not equal to every other citizen's. And you have a specter already where, because of the Electoral College impact, these candidates are not appearing or spending one penny in any state, which is most of the states, that they know are going to go one way or the other. So we're not even campaigning anymore in the whole country. We're just campaigning where there are swing states. And that's good for the swing states, but that's not very good for the ones that aren't swing states. And as Joe Biden has said a number of times lately, if he gets elected, he wants to be president for everybody, caring for everybody, even the people that don't vote for him. And that is a very important thing that I think needs to happen to bring us back into some bipartisan agreements on tough issues. So I don't think you're ever going to get rid of the Electoral College. Amending the Constitution is well near impossible, in my view, politically, because of the process that's required. There are some efforts. One of them is called National Popular Vote, and I think Mary may know more about it than I do. I think they've gotten statutes approved in like 16 states that basically say once you get to 270 electoral votes in enough states, that their electoral votes should be cast for whoever won the national popular vote. So it's conditional on having enough states doing this. But once you do, then that would click in a way, be an amendment to the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College. Now, that would probably have a Supreme Court test, and I have no idea what would happen there. But that's all I know about the Electoral College.
Thank you, Congressman. One of our former statewide appellate judges, my friend Carl Solano, has a question. don't voter expectations matter? Even if the Supreme Court says that the Pennsylvania court exceeded its authority in extending the deadline, isn't there federal law saying that voters shouldn't be disenfranchised for voting in reliance on the Pennsylvania decision, Mary?
First of all, I would say the Supreme Court has not yet said that. We have a statement from from three justices that they would have granted the stay, and they would still like to hear this case even post-election. But the majority in that case did let stand what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did. And one of the in the Wisconsin case, a different case, of course, but in the Wisconsin case, Justice Kavanaugh wrote a very lengthy concurring opinion. And one of the things that he based his decision on in that case was, again, not an opinion, but his decision on how to rule with respect to a stay, was that the federal court in Wisconsin had taken its actions too close to the time of the election, and that causes a lot of uncertainty. And so I think that whatever we may think about how that applies in that particular case, I think that is something that's important here. Expectations. I mean, one of the things that's been very troublesome to me watching the litigation play out throughout the country is voters don't even know day to day what laws are going to apply in their own states. I mean, still, we're getting decisions out every day. And so the only thing you can do, to know for sure your vote will be counted is vote in person, either in early voting if you have it in a state that has it, or on election day. And, that is really unfortunate given that a lot of states have tried to provide other means for people during a pandemic to vote, but the challenges are just so there's just so many of them that there's just a lack of certainty. So I'm in agreement that we need to be a little bit deferential to sort of like public opinion and just public, it's almost like due process for the voter. It's the first time I thought about conceiving it that way, but shouldn't a voter be able to, as of a date certain, rely on what the process is going to be and comply with it without having to worry later that some court's going to change it up and potentially disenfranchise them? Your
ballot has been marked as having been received by the Election Bureau. Can I be confident that I'm now squared away, that I'm taken care of, that my vote will be counted? That's a good point. Daniel White asks, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's recent decision relied heavily on the Pennsylvania Constitution's free and equal elections clause. To what extent do you think, Mary, the Supreme Court of the United States would defer to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's application of Pennsylvania's Constitution in reviewing the decision?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court generally does defer to state Supreme Court's interpretation of state law. But I think the issue here would be, does the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision conflict with federal constitutional law, which defers to state legislatures? So typically there is a lot of deference to state courts' own interpretation of their law, which is why you see federal courts, if cases are brought there first and have a state law component, federal court will often say, we need to certify this to the state court to decide before we can decide this. But this, I think, would go up on a federal constitutional argument.
We're just about out of time, but Congressman Gephardt, I'd love to we've heard from Governor Ridge on this. Congressman Gephardt, what do you think are the best, most effective ways that all of us, citizens, lawyers, non-lawyers alike, can volunteer to fight for election integrity on a local, state, and national level?
Well, I think Tom talked about everybody as a circle of friends and people they work with, and they can have influence. People are going to look to lawyers for answers with some of this. Secondly, we can all volunteer to be poll workers. As I get it, there's a lot of jurisdictions where they're having trouble having adequate number of poll workers as volunteers to help count these votes. Lawyers are particularly well equipped to do that kind of work. Finally, there are a myriad of private efforts like our little national council. There's a group that Mary and I are part of called Keep Our Republic. All of these groups are active. There's many, many others that are active, not only in states, but across the country. People can, look up some research on these groups and help them. Can contribute money to them. They're completely nonpartisan. They're only doing what they're doing to make sure we have a successful election. So there's a lot of opportunities. I was on a call with the University of Pennsylvania Law School a few weeks back. I was on a call with Muhlenberg College in your state, and I think they're active. Parts of them are active in this whole picture. So if you want to get involved, you can get involved.
Thank you so much.
The first time I got involved in politics, I went to the ward committeeman in St. Louis and said, how do I get involved? And he said, well, just volunteer and you'll be involved. And he made me the precinct captain in the 2nd precinct of the 14th ward. That's how I got involved in politics.
And how you've parlayed that into a phenomenal lifetime and a very worthwhile career. And we thank you for your service. And I thank you, Congressman Gephardt, for your time today and your great work on this panel. And Mary McCord from Georgetown Law Center, thank you so very much for really carrying the bulk of this panel today and being our constitutional expert. We really appreciate it. And for those of you who are interested and want to share it with your friends, I believe Keep Our Republic is going to make a video of this available publicly very shortly. So thank you all for your time today. And thank you to Congressman Gephardt, Mary McCord, and Governor Ridge. Have a great day, everybody. And don't forget to vote if you haven't already.